Chapter 8 of the Bonnot Gang, Kings of the Road. Believe me, the secret of reaping the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment from life is to live dangerously. Friedrich Nietzsche. Driving south. Detectives at the Surete were quietly confident that they would soon be able to track down the Rue Ordinaire bandits. Full description with photographs had been published in the national press of three of them. The milieu from whence they came was riddled with informers and under considerable surveillance, and it was almost certain that they were still somewhere in the capital. Scores of letters were still pouring into the Surete, suggesting who the robbers might be and where they were to be found. People wrote down their wildest suspicions in the desperate hope that they might share in the substantial reward offered by the Society General. It meant a lot of fruitless work for the police, but occasionally a letter might seem worth pondering over. One, dated the 23rd of January, contained the following extract. From rumors circulating amongst the anarchists, the assassin of Rue Ordinaire is a certain Eugene Dudon, originally from Nancy, where he has doubtless returned to his parents. The others are three Belgians known as Ortain, Ramond, and Dubois. There's also Bonnot from Lyon. Whether the police made any real use of such information, of course, cannot be determined. Joanne believed that normal detective methods, painstaking research, and patient surveillance would soon enough yield results. Unfortunately for him, his superior Gouchard was not an especially patient man, although for the time being he would let Joanne play it his way. The problem was that if the bandits remained free, not only would they commit more crimes, but others might be tempted to imitate them. Indeed, a copycat robbery had taken place the very day of the first raid on Lanarkey. A Society General bank manager from the Boulevard, Sebastopol branch, was robbed of 50,000 francs in the Rue de Mesly by an armed assailant sporting a thick black mustache. But there was no motorized getaway. It was not the auto bandits. Meanwhile, the illegalists were taking some scientific precautions against the possibility of recognition. Raymond obtained a flask of tincture of silver nitrate from David Bellany, who was still working in the pharmacy, with which to lighten their hair coloring. Bonnot was especially partial to blonde tint. Their mustaches had long since been shaved off. Garnier, of course, could do nothing about his deep penetrating eyes, and Raymond felt it necessary to remind him to look down whenever somebody approached him. Bonnot suggested that they dress well to allay suspicion, and dispense new collars, shirts, and cuffs that he'd bought in Holland. Despite their notoriety, Bonnot and Garnier had no thoughts of laying low or leaving the country. Rather, the chase spurred them on to widen the range of their activities, while keeping Paris as their base. Raymond and Octave even kept in contact with Rirette, meeting once in a restaurant on the Rue de Bretagne, and once in the Rue de Temple, despite the strong possibility that she was being followed. In order to extend the range of their activities, Bonnot, Garnier, and Calaman made use of Jean Debeau and Eugene Dudon, who could supply them with useful contacts in the south and east of the country. Bonnot, Garnier, and Dudon went to visit some of the latter's acquaintances in and around Nancy. They stayed with a factory worker, Charles Reynard, and his wife in Liverdun, on the Moselle, and frequently saw the Bill brothers, Charles and Emily, the former being engaged to the Reinhardt's daughter, Madeleine. Bonnot and Garnier spent their time scouting locations for potential reprises. Debeau and Calaman, meanwhile, made contact with Elie Monnier, a.k.a. Simontoff, who was living in Alias, with a view to setting up a job in the south of France. Monnier was like Garnier an insoumis, a draft dodger, who had similarly made his way to Belgium to escape call-up, and had made contact with the Brussels anarchists. Originally from the small town of Estegel in the eastern Pyrenees, by the age of 16 he was already under surveillance by the police for his anarchist opinion and for keeping bad company. His parents' house was searched after he had been accused of theft in Carcassonne, and he was convicted of an unrelated assault. At 18, Monnier left home and the small libertarian group in Estegel and went to work as a gardener in and around Alais and Nimes, in the Department of the Guard. He spent long periods in Belgium after his call-up papers arrived in August 1909 and acquired a false livret militaire, which at the time had much the same function as the current carte d'identité, enabling him to travel back to France. In 1910, Jean de Beau visited him in Saint Etienne after his expulsion from Switzerland, and later that year, Monnier wrote to L'Anarchie briefly describing an anti-syndicalist intervention by comrades in Arles. They opposed the speech of Léon Jouhaux from the CGT, who was encouraging people to make revolutionary propaganda in the army by declaring that the best tactic was simply not to join at all. To do what Jouhaux suggested was simply to invite comrades to sacrifice themselves to the full brutality of military repression. Hardly surprising that the disciplinary battalions were currently full of committed revolutionaries. In 1911, Monnier worked in the Guard as a traveling salesman and burglar, in the company of Joseph Renard. Renard was also a draft dodger and anarchist, who believed in La Reprise individual, and at the time he was suspected of involvement in the Rue Ordinaire holdup because he was an acquaintance of Garnier and Caroy. As a member of the Estampes gang, he had committed a series of burglaries in and around Paris and Orleans, but his last attempted theft had come to grief. On January 31st, 1912, he was caught burglaring Orleans Station with a companion, who promptly shot himself rather than submit to the police. Their haul was only 143 francs, which the police said was destined for the railway workers' orphanage. Some stamps and a few copper tokens. Renard gave the name Oscar Wilde to his captors and said he'd been born in Canada. Questioned about Rue Ordinaire, the police realized that he was not involved. He knew Garnier from Belgium, where he had worked on Germinal, the Verviers anarchist magazine, in 1910. In November 1911, Laurelot had introduced Renard and Monnier to Paul Sazy, a worker for PLM, the well-known French hotel chain, and also the anarchist individualist contact for Alais and the surrounding area. In February 1912, it was to Sazy and Monnier that de Beau and Calaman went with the view to setting up a job in the south of France. On February 15th, the superb Peugeot limousine was stolen in Béziers from an industrialist and driven northwards towards Paris. At 9 o'clock the next morning, however, it got a flat for Arnier-le-Duc. The occupants, 5 well-dressed men, managed to get a lift from the garage owner as far as Beaune. After lunch, there they caught a train to Paris, arriving at 6:15. Nobody was ever charged with this theft, but Bonnot and his associates were definitely suspected. 4 days later, the press announced that the hunt for Garnier was taking place as far away as Chemnitz and Berlin, but the gang's nest outrage soon made them realize just how close to home the men still were. At Monnier's suggestion, the next targets chosen were the Lavermed mine near Alais and the Comptoir National d'Escompte near Nimes. Their method at Lavernade would be the same as Rue Ordinaire. They would hold up the bank clerk carrying the payroll and escape by car. Simontoff would send a cryptic message by telegram to Dudon's flat at 47 Rue Nollet, the day before the robbery was to take place. Bonnot and Garnier had also planned another job in the east of the country, presumably around Nancy. Late at night on February 26th, Bonnot, Garnier, and Raymond Lascience, all wearing bowler hats, traveled to the exclusive Parisian suburb of Saint-Mond, just west of the Bois de Vincennes, to steal another luxury car. As before, at Boulogne-sur-Seine, they crowbarred their way in, pushed the car into a neighboring street, turned the starting handle, and were away. Again it was Delaunay Belleville, although a different model, a pearl gray double phaeton, worth 20,000 francs. The owner, M. Buisson, had it all ready for the Tour de France. There were 57 liters of petrol in the tank. While on the seats, they found a fox fur-lined cloak, an overcoat with a Strachan collar, gloves, stopwatches, and maps. They planned to travel south to Alais early in the morning, but before catching a few hours' sleep, they painted on a false number plate. The Left Hand of Darkness. They took the usual route south, past Melun, but were held up by a puncture at Montereau. Changing the wheel was not a great problem, but a little further on the car began to develop more serious trouble, and Bonnot was forced to pull up at Pont-sur-Yonne and find a mechanic. The repairs took 4 hours, so that it was getting on for 2 in the afternoon before the car was roadworthy again. The three men had lunch at Villeneuve-sur-Yonne and continued descents, but having covered only 40 miles, and with another 14 hours motoring to go, they decided after an argument, Bonnot judging the repair insufficient for a long trip, to head back to Paris. After all, they had not yet received Monier's telegram, so the delay was not disastrous. Returning via Fontainebleau, Octave Garnier's birthplace, they raced alongside the left bank of the river Seine, through Ivry and into Paris, without stopping at the customs barrier at Port d'Italie. The car was doing 70 kilometers per hour as Bonnot sped up the Avenue des Gobelins into Rue de Mont and across from Ile de la Cite, only yards from the Palais de Justice and the Préfecture de Police. Turning left into the Rue de Rivoli, the car knocked down a market stall, but made no attempt to slow down. At 7 that evening, the Delaunay Belleville was observed by detectives watching 47 Rue Nollet, when it halted on the corner of Rue Nollet and the Rue de Dame. The occupants got out and replenished the tank with petrol taken from a few cans on the back seat. They did not bother to visit Dudon, despite being so close and still awaiting Monier's telegram. Instead, they jumped back in and headed for the Rue d'Amsterdam. The gradient increased the breakneck speed of Bonnot's driving, and as the car careered round the corner into the Place de Havre, he was forced to swerve to avoid colliding with the Saint-Germain to Montmartre bus, which was reversing out of one of the bays in front of Gare Saint-Lazare. The car mounted the pavement, almost knocking over 2 people in the process, and came to a halt. A traffic policeman had seen the whole incident and hurried over to demand the driver's papers. Garnier, meanwhile, jumped out of the back seat and ran round to restart the engine with the starting handle. Bonnot resolutely ignored the cop, who was now brandishing his notebook, and as the motor burst back into life, slammed the gear stick into reverse. Again he had to brake as a lorry came up behind him. As Garnier dived back into the rear seat and Bonnot thrust the gear lever forward, the traffic cop jumped onto the car's running board and tried to grab the steering wheel. Garnier leaned forward, his left hand gripping a Browning automatic, and fired 3 bullets into the policeman's chest and stomach, causing him to reel backwards and collapse onto the road as the Delaunay Bouville roared off down Rue Tronchet. 2 honest citizens attempted to give chase in their own automobile, with a one-man brandishing a gun, but they were mistaken for the bandits by the crowd and surrounded. Despite this, they managed to speed off, only to run over a young woman. Their pursuit was abandoned, and they were severely questioned by the police. The unfortunate woman was badly injured, but never received a sou in compensation from the state or the 2 men responsible, despite several months in hospital. The policeman was quickly ferried to hospital, but died on arrival. Leaving chaos in their wake, the gang, with Bonnot at the wheel, sped at full tilt down the Rue Royale, careened round the Place de la Concorde, and tore up the Champs-Élysées in 4th gear toward the Porte Maillot. The Delaunay Belleville was last spotted leaving Paris in the direction of Pontoise. For 24 hours, Jules, Octave, and Raymond lay low, their plans for the 2 jobs temporarily shelved. It would be virtually impossible to get all the way down to Alais and the Delaunay without being spotted, and in time to meet with Monnier, but they did not wish to abandon the car without having made some good use of it. Around midnight on 29th of February, Bonnot parked the limousine in front of the Pontoise town hall. Despite the house of a well-to-do lawyer, Raymond and Octave stealthily made their way over to the side door of the house and levered it open using a crowbar. It did not take them long to find the old freestanding safe in the study, as they had obviously done some homework beforehand. Perhaps Bonnot was still introducing himself to unsuspecting lawyers as a local businessman, as he had previously done around Lyon. Unfortunately, the two illegalists made some noise trying to move the heavy old safe and disturbed the bourgeois upstairs. Despite their bravado, Raymond and Octave were still amateurs. The wife roused her husband, who reluctantly went over to the window, and seeing the baker passing by, called out to him to check that his doors were secure. He obliged, made his way up the path, and tried the door handle. As he did so, Galliman and Garnier leapt out, fired into the air, and raced for the car. Amazingly alert for that time of night, the lawyer grabbed his pistol and managed to lose off 6 shots from the upstairs window before the pair had even reached the car. They both turned and sent several bullets flying through the window before diving into the car and roaring off towards Paris. Half an hour later, they were approaching the northern outskirts of the capital, where they intended to abandon the car, as it was obviously too dangerous to try entering one of the gates into the city. In Saint-Ouen, they found a suitably quiet location between a factory and a garage, at the end of a new stretch of road. Garnier was determined that they should destroy their latest appropriated luxury item, and to this end began scrabbling around gathering straw and flammable material, which he stuffed inside the car. He hurriedly poured petrol over it, and then tossed in a match, causing the Delaunay to burst into flame. All 3 of them ran off south towards the Butte de Montmartre, on which the bare outlines of the Sacré-Cœur could just be made out in the pre-dawn light. Stalemate. The blatant murder of a policeman at one of the busiest crossroads in Paris had immediate repercussions. Guichard was summoned before Lapine, the prefect of police, to explain why these auto bandits had not been arrested after 3 months. He had their names, he knew their milieu. Surely he must be close to making some significant arrests. The police were being made to look like fools by a bunch of crazed anarchists, and the press was having a field day. The Minister of the Interior was up in arms about it. There was already enough to cope with the taxi drivers' strike, which was still dragging on from the previous year, and which was getting more violent, what with bombs going off in scab taxis. Both he and the minister wanted to see some results, which would prove to the press and the public that they were on the case. Guichard promised to see to it immediately, and promptly got on to Joanne. The premises of l'Idée Libre were still under constant surveillance, since Garnier's lover Marie had been found there during the raid on 23rd of January. Detectives disregarded the fact that the 3rd issue of the magazine had subtitled itself, "Neither for illegalism nor for honesty." The police had warrants out for both Dubois and Dudon, and they knew that the former had worked there as a typographer, and that Louise, the latter's wife, had been living with Lorillot until somewhere around the previous Christmas. Besides, not only were Garnier and Croy associates of Lorillot from Romainville, but since the start of February, Jean Bellardi, Croy's erstwhile lover, had moved in with Lorillot. The police kept a constant watch on all people going in or out of the premises at Passage de Clichy, and on 25th of February trailed one of the typographer's girlfriends, Madeleine Norrison, to 47 Rue Nolette. 2 days later, on the very morning of the incident at the Place de Havre, detectives had succeeded in renting a room from the widow Rolette, right opposite the suspect's room. Having ascertained that the man Aubertin was there with his wife and child, Joanne was sure that he now had Dudon, and that further patient surveillance would lead him to the principal perpetrators of the Rue Ordinaire holdup. Not surprisingly, then, Guichard's order immediately to arrest Dudon came as a bombshell to Joanne. He was almost on the verge of solving the case when this insane order came through, telling him to abandon his best lead on the gang, simply in order to save face and pander to the press and government ministers. Joanne could hardly contain his exasperation. This could set the case back weeks. Nevertheless, it was his duty to carry out the orders of his superior. So he calmly went and explained to the surveillance team what had happened at the Place de Havre and what now had to be done here. The detectives reported that Aubertin had received a telegram earlier reading, "Our mother in good health," upon receipt of which he went out and made a telephone call. Besides that, there was nothing to report except that Aubertin family now had a visitor, a dark-haired man in his early 20s. Given that the gang were classed as armed and extremely dangerous, Joanne decided not to carry out the arrests until the suspects were outside the apartment. He didn't want to go bursting in and provoke a shootout, which might result in another police fatality. Joanne's approach was strictly softly, softly. Soon enough, the visitor left, making his way down the stairs and into the street. Unknown to him, he was followed by 4 detectives who waited until he was some distance away and then pounced. Jean de Beau suddenly found himself with his face pressed against the cold stone of the trottoir and his hands handcuffed behind his back. The police plucked a 9mm Browning from each pocket, as well as 23 loose 9mm rounds. Not long after, Eugene Dudon left the apartment, but he didn't even make it down the stairs. Joanne and 3 other officers seized him from behind and disarmed him. They burst into the flat and arrested Louise, and then ransacked the place. More weapons were discovered, as well as maps upon which were marked points at which the Swiss and Italian borders could be crossed, so avoiding custom posts. They also found a ticket for the left luggage office at the Gare du Nord, which tied in with information received that some of the stolen checks and bonds from the Rue Ordinaire holdup were being kept in consignes in the main Paris railway stations. Guichard had already ordered that they all be put under surveillance. Following these 3 arrests, the police pulled in the typographer, his girlfriend Madeleine, and Bouchette for questioning, while Victor was put under further pressure to cooperate by the rearrest of Rorette. Jean de Beau's flat at 16 Boulevard des Vignes, which he'd rented in the false name of Henry Migny, had thoroughly searched and the standard burglar's equipment found, but Dudon's mother's house in Nancy was declared to be clean. Other detectives hastened down to Alais to try and find out about the mysterious telegram that had been sent there to Dudon. They soon realized their suspect, Simontoff, had flown, forewarned of trouble by the press reports of the outrage at the Place de Havre, which he obviously recognized as the work of his illegalist comrades. Back at the Surete, Jean de Beau and Eugene Dudon were initially charged with carrying prohibited weapons, although other charges were likely to follow. The others, Bouchette, Madeleine Norrison, Louise, and Rorette, were all released on the 1st of March, the funeral day of policeman Francois Garnier. The prefect of police, Louise Lepine, gave a short graveside oration during which he bemoaned the fact that the criminals of Paris are numbered in their thousands. But the problem for the police was that they weren't just ordinary criminals, they were illegalists, who had strong ideological motivations behind their actions, and whose non-acceptance of the hierarchical ordering of society could lead them to carry out much more daring, if desperate, acts. They were not like the 5-man burglary gang arrested in Clichy, who were straight criminals, without an ideological justification for their acts, acquiring money and commodities in order to be able to live a bit more like the bourgeois. The high spot of their year being to take a holiday in the fashionable resort of Deauville, on the Normandy coast. Their self-realization acted out on capitalist terms, without giving any thought to transcending capitalist relations. But although the police clearly saw the illegalists as a special case, not everyone agreed with them. The socialists made a blanket condemnation, not just of illegalism, but also of criminality and, of course, anarchism, which they declared was quite simply capitalist activity. For the anarchists, however, the problem was closer to home, and many activists were worried about the repression that might fall on the rest of the movement, as well as the sullying of the anarchist ideal. As the Italian anarchist Luigi Galliani had written a few years earlier, there were those, especially in the more respectable circles, who, disturbed by problems of conscience, made uneasy about the threat of reaction, distressed by residual evangelism, rushed to belittle, to shame the act of rebellion. Lorillot had already made his position against illegalism clear in the columns of l'Idée Libre, but not even L'Anarchie was beginning to ask questions. Armand had taken over the editing of the paper in the second week of February, and was in Paris each Monday and Tuesday, despite still living in Orleans. In the second edition, under his editorship, Hermann Stern asked about the illegalists, sont-ils des nôtres, are they with us, but concluded that it was not the time to break solidarity with them. The illegalists knew that there were still some comrades in the milieu that could be counted on. They might yet come up for the arrests of Jean and Eugene. There was the old Russian refugee Godorowski, a veteran of Lanarkey since its inception, who allowed the gang to use his flat in Montmartre. There was young Andre Poyer, an acquaintance of the now imprisoned Louis Rimbaud, who could provide them with brand new high-quality weapons. David Bellany, Bonnot's old friend from Lyon, could always be relied on. Ginger-haired René Vallée, withdrawn but intense, was already helping out his comrades by renting safe houses and casing banks with his companion Anna, and Elie Monnier from Alais, who would be a sleeper in the southern suburbs of Paris. But besides these particular individuals, from whom Bonnot, Garnier, and Calaman might expect direct support, there was perhaps more importantly the general anarchist sense of duty to provide shelter for all those trying to escape the authorities. And of course that meant no questions asked. Despite its nominal individualism, this anarchist network was not only quite widespread, but also possessed a keen sense of practical solidarity towards other comrades from the milieu. They also had none of the moral qualms that certain other anarchists exhibited in aiding and abetting crime. Even comrades such as Lorillot, who disagreed with the illegalists, would never help the police. It had taken the Surete their 3 months to track down Eugene Dudon, their first major lead, and now with his arrest they were virtually back to square one. Paris was swamped with detectives and police, watching, listening, awaiting that indiscretion, that hint of something suspicious that might put them back on the scent again.